Neutral is a place of no movement. It means you're not making progress towards the goals or the ideas that are really important to you. Welcome to Beyond Neutral, where we talk about what gets you stuck and how we can shift and navigate the road forward. As leaders, as professionals in our careers, or just balancing and creating the kind of life you desire. I'm your host, Paula Reed. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to today's episode of Beyond Neutral. So we're talking about emotions. Last episode, I talked about joy and the importance of joy. And today I want to talk about another emotion, an emotion that impacts all of us, and that is the emotion of fear. One of the things that I mentioned in my last episode is that emotions are, they're information, right? And they're information that basically impacts every single thing that we do. They're always with us. We're never without some type of emotion, even if it's contentment. Okay. We're always have an emotion with us, and it propels us and it motivates us and it impacts our behavior and our decisions. And it has a huge impact on our relationships with other people. And the key is to recognize the information that emotions are giving us and to be able to appreciate and process the insight they're offering without allowing them to hijack us, but rather to experience emotions in a balanced way that best serves us, right? So understanding them, recognizing them, acknowledging them, and processing them can be a really beneficial process to go through and a thing to understand. So I want to talk today about fear. Fear is the oldest emotion that we have. It actually evolved from our reptilian brain, and it came about as a means of survival, right? That's why we experience it. We originally experienced it to be able to enable us to survive. When you think about that, it's also the most powerful emotion that we have. Not the strongest, by the way, the most powerful. And I define power as its ability to influence. When you think about a powerful personality, right? It's its ability to influence. And as such, it can hijack us. The strongest emotion, by the way, is love. And strength being an ability to be a force against something else. So fear is an incredibly powerful emotion. So if you think about how the emotion of fear evolved in us, it evolved by way of survival, right? We saw a threat, we saw danger. And as a result of that, we had fear. And that fear, as a result of that danger, that impending a threat to our survival, we actually created a physiological response in our bodies that happens when we actually evoke the emotion of fear. And that is physiologically, our heart starts beating faster, our blood pressure increases, but our blood flow, even our oxygen supply, starts being redirected from our brain into our limbs. So if you think about the instinctual reaction to fear, it's a fight or flight response, right? And so blood flow goes to our extremities, to our arms and to our legs, our arms to to punch or fight, our feet to fly or run or get us the heck out of there, and less around like logical, critical thinking, decision making. It's really an immediate reaction to an immediate threat. That's what fear is. Okay. So that's why the emotion exists and how it works within us. Fast forward to where we are today and our current human existence, right? And you're thinking, well, I don't walk around with fear all the time. I don't experience a survival instinct all the time. So what's the big deal about that? And yes, that's true. However, we experience fear in a different way now. It's evolved. And the way that we can experience fear now is, and this can be in our relationships, in our work life, in our social circles, whatever it is, we experience it in different ways. It can show up differently than physical safety. It can show up as defensiveness, okay? Being defensive, that is actually a fear response. So if you think for a moment about that, if you say something or you take an action and somebody questions it, okay? And your reaction is to basically go, wait a minute, right? You become defensive, you defend yourself. Think about what that actual reaction is. That's a fear response, okay? Skepticism is a fear response. Like, what? Wait a minute. What's actually happening here? It's that pulling back, right? Being doubtful, being suspicious, even being tense. Tense is a fear response when you think about it. Like if you're walking through the forest and you see a tiger, what's your immediate response? Is you tense up. Those are all fear responses. So fear is really about automatically moving to protect ourselves. And how we can do it in the modern day, as I just explained, is in this emotional response that still has the same impact, which is our curious brains, our questioning brains, they kick off, right? And our anxious brains kick in. And so our ability to really take in additional information, see additional signs, read additional data, that gets reduced because we're defending ourselves. We're surviving now, right? So the downside is that we immediately go into protecting ourselves. And as a result of protecting ourselves, we turn off data and we also can lose connection with another person. That if your fear response is happening in a conversation with somebody and you become defensive, you're losing the insight of additional information because your ability to listen and process that is turned off. Okay. Fear of being wrong is another one that kicks in. That's another thing that will create that response. Fear of change creates that response. Fear of failure creates that response. So all of these things, while we might not be afraid of physical danger on a regular basis, we do experience fear on a very regular basis in our work lives, in our relationships, wherever it is. Now, like all emotions, there's a gift to experiencing fear, right? Fear can be very motivating. That's what makes you run from the tiger. You're motivated by the fear. It can also propel you to work harder. It can be the thing that makes you prepare well for a presentation. So there's a motivation of it, okay? Having no fear, that's not beneficial either because people who are fearless often don't see risks. They can put themselves in situations that they probably shouldn't put themselves in, either physically or emotionally, okay? They can also make premature decisions without really evaluating the implications of their decisions because they have no fear about it. They can miss other people's experiences of fear and only filter through their own experience, and therefore they're not really connecting well. So fear absolutely serves a purpose. The challenge is that when our fear is really elevated in our everyday lives, or when we access it too quickly, or we go to that almost as a default mechanism in certain situations, and it becomes an automatic response in stressful situations, especially in relationships with other people, then the gift of that emotion, the gift of what that's trying to tell you, has been diluted by the excessive presence in any given experience. And the result of that can be paralysis, right? It can be an inability to make a decision. It can be withdrawing from others because we're fearful of what that's saying, of what the implications can be. It can be blaming. It can be blaming the other person for a situation that maybe isn't really all of their doing. It can be blaming ourselves. It can be defensiveness. So an excessive presence of fear eliminates our ability to really continue to take in effective data and effectively sit in a relationship with somebody that may be beneficial to us or may, teach us something. So how do you manage it? Because that's what we're really here to really think about and talk about it. The very first thing to really managing your fear is to acknowledge it. And that's not that easy to do, but because a lot of times we get to the anxiety of it and not the root of it. And we'll talk about anxiety, in my next episode, because those two things certainly go hand in hand. But it is really significantly important to sit down and recognize that, for example, being defensive, I'm defensive. What is it you really are? You're fearful. Okay. What is it that you're afraid of? I'm afraid of being wrong. What does being wrong tell you? Tells me I'm not good enough. Okay. It tells me I made a mistake. It tells me whatever. Get to what the real fear is, number one. Okay. And start paying attention to what triggers it. When you feel fear in relationships and situations with a boss, with a colleague, with a friend, with an intimate relationship that you're in, whatever it is, okay? What are the situations that trigger the fear? Okay. Is there a pattern to those? And that's really significant in terms of understanding, because quite often the fear that we are experiencing as adults is a function of something that happened a long time ago that we may not even be connecting to. May not consciously be aware of what the thing is that triggers that fear. Okay. And so looking at whether or not there's a pattern to that is very helpful. And then sometimes identifying where this came from, and once you start identifying where it came from, you can lessen the hold on that, okay? It's also important within that to understand what the payoff is in staying in the fear. What is the upside to staying in that fear? I'll give you an example of this pattern that's happened in my own life. I can recall a while ago buying a car, a particular car that I was excited about. It was a luxury car, a nice car. And I had bought it and I had signed the paperwork and everything. And as I'm driving in it, I have this overwhelming sense of fear. Like, what is this? And I had to really, really think about it. Well, in my family, I grew up, I think I've mentioned this before. My dad was incredibly poor as a child. And he quite often didn't have food on the table. He went hungry a lot. There were times where he didn't even know where he was going to sleep at night. So he had an extremely impoverished childhood that obviously was a very fearful existence for him. So while I grew up in a family that I never worried about food, I never worried about having a roof over my head. I always knew there was a place for me to be sheltered and fed. And I grew up in a very safe environment. My father's anxiety around that and his fear, fundamentally his fear about money, translated to me in a fear of money and in a story that I often told myself about money and how you spend it and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I realized that I carried forward his fears. I carried forward to myself in a money story that often translated into don't spend your money on anything frivolous because you may not have it tomorrow and you may be hungry. Okay. And so buying a car that was, I mean, any car can get you from A to Z. It's a question of how comfortable it is and how you feel driving it and all the ego stuff that goes with that. And so when I was driving that car, I remember realizing that that fear that I was feeling was this fear of running out of money because I had not spent it wisely, or the story I was telling myself was I had not spent it wisely. There was no logic to me being fearful about that. I am very wise with how I spend my money, but this was so ingrained in me, in my value system and in my upbringing. My father's fears became so ingrained in me and became my fears that I have started to notice, and that was like one of the first times I noticed it, this automatic trigger whenever I did something that was beyond the essential, beyond the basics, that I would, and I still struggle with it at times, have this fear that creeps in. And I have to now say, okay, no, I know what that is. That's my father reminding me to be smart about what I spend my money on. Okay. But so going through this pattern of realizing what triggers it, realizing the pattern, and then looking at, well, does this connect to anything at any point in my life? And realizing that piece of it, I could say, okay, that's what it is. And it gave me the ability to manage that fear more effectively. Now, The other thing to ask yourself as you go through that process is, what is the payoff of staying in that fear? And often the payoff of staying in that fear is safety, right? If I don't spend my money, I have more of it, right? But in a lot of ways, it also took away choice, okay? Because then you say, well, what am I giving up by staying in that? And I realized one of the things I'm giving up in that is the ability to reward myself in certain ways for hard work. And it's okay to reward yourself. So one of the ways to get out of this fear response is to, first of all, recognize the pattern, pay attention to the fear, name the fear, own it. It's okay that you have it. Own that you have the fear. Then think about and look at what triggers it, okay? Then think about what the payoff is to staying out of it, to staying in it, and what the benefit is to moving out of it. So you're seeking clarity around the triggers and the payoffs of fear. And if you think about this in terms of like a fear of change, okay, what is it that you're really fearing? You're fearing needing to learn something new. You're fearing not being successful in a new situation. You're fearing the ambiguity of the unknown, okay? What is the benefit of that? The benefit of it is, of staying in that fear, is then I don't have to go out into that. If I stay afraid of this change, okay, then I don't have to experience, if I stay where I am, then I don't have to experience the change. I'm safe. What is the downside? The downside is you don't learn and you don't grow and you don't get exposed to new things. Common fear is a fear of change. So those are just some examples to think about of both the gift that fear gives you and the negative implications of experiencing that too much, or of going to that, defaulting to that when you're in a situation, in a stressful situation that actually triggers that emotion. Okay. So the very way, and I talk about this a lot with emotions, the way to manage them and to get the gift out of them is to recognize them. You can't bury them. You have to say, yes, I'm afraid of this. What is that fear? What is it telling you? What is the gift? And what is the thorn of staying in it, right? The rose and the thorn. Always look at those things. And just seek clarity around it. I can promise you that the more that you kind of get to, yeah, this is really what I'm afraid of, and you start looking at the logic of it, okay, once you've named it, the less hold it will have on you. And the important thing to recognize is that you can't get over it if you can't name it, because you can't intellectualize a fear. And if you've ever been in that situation where somebody says, well, why are you afraid of that? And they give you all the reasons. It's like, it doesn't matter until you've recognized it and you've owned it and you've sat in it. Nobody intellectualizing it for you is going to change that for you. This is an internal experience. And the only person who can manage an internal experience differently is you. So step into it, lean into it, understand it, know what triggers it, recognize the gift it's trying to give you, but also recognize when it's being overused. Thank yourself, be thankful for the gift, and now put it aside and think about what are alternative ways that you can manage and process that emotion. Anticipate that a little bit. Think about ways that you can respond differently when that fear comes up. And think about the reward in responding differently to it. That is my thought of the day on the gift and the curse of the emotion of fear. I hope you found that helpful. Thank you for joining me today. If you would like to talk further about this topic or any other things that you think might be interesting, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out. And in the meantime, enjoy the drive. Take care. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode of Beyond Neutral. Make sure to visit our website, www.readandco.com, for this week's show notes. That's REIDNCO.com. And if you found value in today's episode, I would really appreciate you giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, share it with a friend. Also, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. All of this helps to support the show. Thanks so much. Take care.